The annual Lantern Hill Summer Festival had always been the crown jewel of the village calendar, and this particular July evening promised to be no exception. Paper lanterns swayed gently from the ancient oak trees surrounding the village green, their warm glow casting dancing shadows across the assembled crowd. The air hummed with cheerful conversation, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter from children chasing fireflies between the refreshment stalls. Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably on a wooden bench near the bandstand, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue cardigan. To casual observers, she appeared entirely absorbed in her stitches, but her sharp eyes missed nothing of the small drama unfolding around her. The festival, she reflected, was rather like a stage where the same players performed their familiar roles year after year, though tonight there seemed to be an undercurrent of tension threading through the usual pleasantries. Near the prize table, Mr. Reginald Ashworth, the village's most prosperous resident and festival patron, stood in animated conversation with young Timothy Fletcher, the new bank manager. Even from her distance, Miss Marple could see the flush of anger on Ashworth's usually composed face, and the way Fletcher kept glancing nervously toward the crowd, as if seeking escape. "I simply won't tolerate any more delays, Fletcher." Ashworth's voice carried clearly across the green. "This matter must be resolved immediately, or there will be consequences." Fletcher's response was lost in the general hubbub, but Miss Marple noted how his hands trembled as he adjusted his spectacles. Money troubles, she suspected, had a way of making even the most confident young men appear vulnerable. Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, the vicar's wife, bustled past with a tray of sandwiches, pausing to whisper urgently to Mrs. Gladys Hartwell, the village postmistress. "Did you see how Eleanor Ashworth arrived separately tonight? And that new secretary of his, Miss Vivian Thornley, she's been looking positively haggard lately." Miss Marple's needles never paused, but she filed away these observations with the practiced ease of someone who understood that village secrets were often hidden in plain sight. She noticed how Dr. Alistair Croft stood apart from the festivities, his usually genial expression replaced by something approaching hostility as he watched Ashworth's increasingly heated discussion with Fletcher. As the evening progressed, the crowd began to gather around the small platform where the traditional lantern lighting ceremony would take place. Ashworth, as the festival's primary benefactor, was expected to deliver the opening remarks and light the ceremonial beacon that would signal the start of the evening's entertainment. The brass band struck up a cheerful march, and conversations gradually subsided as people turned their attention to the platform. Miss Marple folded her knitting and joined the expectant crowd, positioning herself where she could observe both the ceremony and the faces of those around her. Minutes passed. The band finished their piece and began another. Murmurs rippled through the assembly as Ashworth failed to appear. Mrs. Pemberton looked increasingly flustered, glancing repeatedly toward the refreshment tent where Ashworth had last been seen. "Where on earth has Reginald got to?" she whispered to her husband, the Reverend Pemberton. Young Timothy Fletcher, his earlier nervousness now replaced by genuine concern, volunteered to search for the missing patron. He returned moments later, his face drained of all color, stumbling slightly as he approached the platform. "Please," he called out, his voice cracking with strain, "someone must fetch the police immediately. Mr. Ashworth. He's dead." The cheerful festival atmosphere shattered like glass. In the sudden, terrible silence that followed, Miss Marple found herself studying the shocked faces around her, noting which showed genuine surprise and which seemed to reflect something else entirely. The murder at Lantern Hill had begun. The cheerful festival atmosphere shattered like delicate glass as Timothy Fletcher's words echoed across the village green. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then panic rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. Children pressed closer to their parents while adults exchanged bewildered glances, their faces illuminated by the now ominous glow of the paper lanterns swaying overhead. Miss Marple remained seated on her bench, her knitting needles continuing their gentle rhythm as she observed the unfolding drama with keen interest. She noted how different people processed shock in distinctly different ways, some with genuine surprise, others with what appeared to be carefully controlled relief, and a few with expressions that suggested they weren't entirely unprepared for such news. Dr. Alistair Croft immediately pushed through the gathering crowd, his medical training overriding whatever personal animosity he harbored toward the deceased. "Stand back, please," he commanded with professional authority, though Miss Marple noticed his hands weren't entirely steady as he disappeared into the storage tent. The murmur of voices gradually subsided as people strained to hear what was happening inside. When Dr. Croft emerged several minutes later, his face was grim. "The police must be called immediately," he announced. "Mr. Ashworth has been strangled with what appears to be a length of cord. He's been dead for some time." Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton had already dispatched her husband to telephone from the vicarage, and the word "strangled" fluttered through the crowd like a sparrow, landing in dozens of speculative minds at once. Constable Ned Bell, a broad-shouldered man more accustomed to mediating disputes over stray dogs than investigating murder, arrived within minutes and quickly secured the storage tent, his movements betraying his nervousness about the gravity of the situation. As the initial shock began to wear off, theories sprouted from every corner of the village green. Mrs. Gladys Hartwell, the postmistress, proved particularly vocal as she held court near the refreshment stand. "I always said there was something not quite right about that man," she declared to anyone within listening distance. "The way he treated poor Timothy Fletcher this evening was absolutely shameful. And those sharp words about business matters, banks don't argue about hymn tunes, do they?" Miss Marple's observant eyes swept across the crowd, cataloguing reactions with the practiced ease of someone who understood that village secrets were often hidden in plain sight. Eleanor Ashworth stood frozen near the prize table, her hand pressed to her mouth, pearl earrings quivering with each shallow breath. Her earlier red-rimmed eyes, and the deliberate distance she had maintained from her husband throughout the evening, had not escaped Miss Marple's notice. Timothy Fletcher paced nervously near the police cordon, his spectacles fogged and his earlier composure completely shattered. "I didn't touch anything," he kept repeating to anyone who would listen, as if fearful that any movement might implicate him further. His obvious panic seemed disproportionate to simply discovering a body. Miss Marple mused quietly. Miss Vivian Thornley, Ashworth's secretary, clutched a notebook to her chest, despite the warm evening air, her face pale as spun wax under the lantern light. She had been conspicuously absent from much of the earlier festivities, Miss Marple recalled, and now stood on the periphery of the crowd, her eyes darting nervously between the cordoned tent and the assembled villagers. Within the hour, Inspector Craddock arrived with his sergeant, his methodical approach bringing some semblance of order to the chaos. Miss Marple knew the inspector well from previous unfortunate events and observed with approval as he began the careful work of questioning witnesses and examining the scene. As statements were taken and the crowd gradually thinned, with many villagers drifting home to spread the shocking news, Miss Marple found herself studying the remaining suspects with renewed interest. The gentle clicking of her knitting needles provided a soothing counterpoint to the whispered conversations around her as she began to form her first tentative theories about what had really transpired in that storage tent behind the cheerful facade of the Lantern Hill Summer Festival. The paper lanterns continued their gentle dance overhead as Inspector Craddock established his methodical approach to the investigation, transforming the festive village green into an organized crime scene. Miss Marple remained seated on her bench, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm, while her observant eyes catalogued every detail of the unfolding drama with the practiced ease of someone who understood that truth often hid behind the most innocent facades. Craddock's preliminary examination of the storage tent had yielded several crucial pieces of information. "Death occurred between 8 and 9 this evening," he announced to his sergeant, his voice carrying clearly across the now subdued gathering. The murder weapon appears to be cord from the lantern bundles readily available and requiring no premeditation. Most significantly, there are no signs of struggle, suggesting the victim knew and trusted his attacker. Miss Marple's needles paused momentarily as she processed this revelation. No struggle often indicated either complete surprise or, more tellingly, the comfortable proximity of someone familiar. Reginald Ashworth had been a man who demanded deference, she reflected. Someone accustomed to having people approach him without question. The first formal interview was with Timothy Fletcher, whose agitation had only intensified since discovering the body. Seated in a folding chair near the bandstand, he recounted his confrontation with Ashworth with trembling hands and a voice that cracked with strain. "We quarreled about banking irregularities," he admitted reluctantly. Mr. Ashworth was demanding immediate explanations and threatening consequences if matters weren't resolved tonight. "I left him by the refreshment tent around 8:20. Mrs. Gladys Hartwell, ever the village's unofficial chronicler of scandal, had positioned herself within earshot of the interviews. "Banking irregularities," she whispered loudly to Mrs. Pemberton. "That's a polite way of saying embezzlement, isn't it?" And poor Timothy looked absolutely terrified when Ashworth was browbeating him earlier. Eleanor Ashworth's interview proved equally revealing, though for different reasons. Her carefully controlled composure wavered as she confirmed arriving separately from her husband following an earlier disagreement. "We had been experiencing certain difficulties," she stated with measured precision, though Miss Marple noted how her hands trembled slightly and her gaze flickered nervously toward Miss Thornley during her recital. The secretary stood apart from the main group, still clutching her water-stained notebook with an almost protective intensity. Dr. Croft's professional assessment confirmed the preliminary findings while adding medical authority to the timeline. Yet, Miss Marple detected something beneath his clinical detachment, a fleeting expression that suggested the doctor's feelings toward the deceased were far from neutral. His earlier confrontation with Ashworth over charitable contributions had clearly left lasting resentment. Miss Vivian Thornley's interview presented perhaps the most intriguing contradictions. Her composure seemed almost unnaturally perfect, her answers precisely delivered despite the obvious strain of the evening. She described helping with festival preparations and fetching forgotten papers for her employer, but Miss Marple's earlier observations had placed the secretary conspicuously absent from most preparation activities. The notebook she clutched bore distinct water stains despite the clear evening, and there was a thin cut on her finger that she attributed to lantern preparations. As the interviews continued, layers of village resentment began emerging through whispered conversations. Mrs. Hartwell proved particularly informative, detailing Ashworth's various business dealings and the enemies he had accumulated through foreclosures and aggressive tactics. "He muscled old Henderson out of his cottage last year," she confided. "And there was that nasty business with the Miller family's farm loan." Timothy Fletcher's final statement caught Miss Marple's particular attention. He mentioned being with the band conductor, discussing the march order when the beacon was to be lit. Yet the ceremonial beacon remained unlit throughout the evening. Such alibis built on non-existent events often revealed more than their creators intended. As the formal questioning concluded and villagers began drifting homeward, Miss Marple folded her knitting and prepared to leave. The evening had provided a wealth of observations about human nature under stress, and she found herself contemplating not just the physical evidence, but the intricate web of relationships, resentments, and secrets that had existed beneath Lantern Hill's placid surface. Murder, she knew from long experience, rarely sprang from sudden impulse, but rather from old grievances worn thin through repeated humiliation and suppressed anger. The morning after brought a grey drizzle that seemed to wash the festive spirit from Lantern Hill, leaving the village green scattered with soggy decorations and the melancholy remnants of interrupted celebration. Miss Marple made her way to the post office through the gentle rain, ostensibly to purchase stamps, but primarily to observe how the community was processing the previous evening's shocking events. Murder, she had long ago learned, revealed as much about the living as it did about the dead. Mrs. Gladys Hartwell held court behind her counter with the authority of someone who possessed both official postal duties and unofficial access to village secrets. "Mark my words," she declared to a small gathering of customers. "That young Timothy Fletcher is our man. Did you see how he kept stammering about those banking matters? And the way he rushed to find Mr. Ashworth, almost as if he knew exactly where to look." Miss Marple purchased her stamps while listening carefully to the theories circulating through the cramped space. The consensus seemed to favor Fletcher as the obvious suspect, his financial troubles and public confrontation with Ashworth providing convenient motives that satisfied most people's desire for simple explanations. However, she had learned long ago that village opinion, like morning mist, often obscured more than it revealed. There was something else. "Mrs. Hartwell continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I saw Miss Thornley at the pump near the green around 8:30, splashing water about like she was doing the washing. Got her notebook thoroughly soaked, the poor girl. Said she'd spilled lemonade, but I thought she looked as if she'd been crying." Inspector Craddock arrived shortly after Miss Marple, his expression indicating that the investigation had already yielded significant developments. His questioning of Fletcher that morning had only seemed to solidify police suspicions. The young bank manager's timeline placed him near the storage tent at the crucial moment, and his claimed conversation with the band conductor about the ceremonial beacon proved troublingly vague when pressed for details. The irregularities Mr. Ashworth mentioned weren't embezzlement, Fletcher explained desperately when Miss Marple encountered him by the bandstand. They were unauthorized loans I'd approved for struggling families. He discovered my compassionate lending practices and threatened to have me dismissed and prosecuted. Miss Marple studied the young man's haggard face with the gentle attention she might give to a wounded sparrow. His genuine distress seemed inconsistent with the calculated coldness required for murder, though she knew from experience that desperation could drive even gentle souls to extreme measures. "My dear young man," she said softly, "panic often makes innocent people appear guilty, just as composure can make guilty people appear innocent." As Fletcher hurried away, clearly seeking to avoid further scrutiny, Miss Marple found her attention drawn to the pile of festival debris near the storage tent. Constable Bell was methodically collecting evidence under Inspector Craddock's supervision, including several bundles of cord used for the lantern displays. Most were tied with neat, professional knots, but one bundle had been hastily retied with a clumsy granny knot, its ends roughly cut rather than properly trimmed. Miss Marple observed quietly, approaching the cordoned area. "I notice someone has been rather careless with their knot work." Craddock followed her gaze and nodded grimly. "The murder weapon came from these bundles. Someone took what they needed and attempted to cover their tracks by retying the remaining cord." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, examining the sloppy handiwork. "A person accustomed to tying proper knots would do so automatically, even under stress. This suggests either someone unused to such work or someone working in considerable haste and darkness." The morning's revelations had painted Fletcher as the obvious culprit, and his financial desperation and public humiliation providing clear motives that satisfied both police logic and village gossip. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly skeptical of such convenient solutions. The murder had required someone Ashworth trusted enough to meet privately, someone with access to the festival preparations, and someone capable of the swift, silent efficiency that left no signs of struggle. As she made her way home through the persistent drizzle, Miss Marple reflected on the curious absence of Eleanor Ashworth from the village's gossip networks. The widow had retreated to her substantial home on the hill, maintaining a dignified silence that might conceal either overwhelming grief or carefully hidden relief. There was also the matter of Miss Thornley's water-stained notebook and her peculiar behavior at the pump, details that seemed insignificant to others, but struck Miss Marple as potentially crucial pieces in a puzzle that was far more complex than it initially appeared. The obvious suspect, she mused, was often the least likely culprit, particularly when village opinion formed so quickly and decisively around such convenient evidence. The afternoon brought a shift in Miss Marple's approach as she decided that a quiet visit to the vicarage might yield more insights than observing from her usual bench. The morning's discovery of the clumsily retied cord had planted a seed of curiosity that required careful cultivation, and she suspected that Mrs. Dorothy Pemberton, with her intimate knowledge of festival preparations, might provide crucial context. She found the vicar's wife in a state of considerable agitation, her usual composure frayed by the morning's developments, and Inspector Craddock's increasingly thorough questioning of village residents. "It's all so terribly disturbing," Mrs. Pemberton confided as she served tea with trembling hands. "Poor Timothy Fletcher being questioned again, and now the inspector wants to examine all our committee records." Miss Marple accepted her cup with gentle thanks, noting how Mrs. Pemberton's distress seemed disproportionate to mere social embarrassment. "The festival preparations must have been quite demanding," she observed mildly. "So many details to coordinate, particularly the lantern arrangements." "Oh yes, absolutely exhausting," Mrs. Pemberton agreed, then paused thoughtfully. "Though I must say, Mr. Ashworth was wonderfully particular about those details. He insisted on overseeing the cord deliveries himself, checking every knot personally. Said he'd served in the Royal Navy during his youth and was quite a stickler for proper seamanship." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily as this revelation settled into place. Ashworth's naval background cast the morning's discovery of the poorly retied cord in an entirely new light. A man trained in naval knotwork would never have left such clumsy handiwork, even under stress. The granny knot wasn't Ashworth's work at all, it was evidence of someone else's hasty attempt to cover their tracks. "I don't suppose you noticed anything unusual about Miss Thornley yesterday evening?" Miss Marple inquired with casual interest. "She seemed rather distressed when I observed her later." Mrs. Pemberton's expression grew troubled. "Now that you mention it, I found her by the storage tent around 8 o'clock, looking quite pale and tearing pages from that notebook of hers. Said she was updating her employer's schedule, but it seemed an odd time for such housekeeping. She appeared to have been crying." The timeline placed Miss Thornley at the scene, precisely when Dr. Croft had estimated the murder occurred, yet no one seemed to consider the secretary's presence significant. The notebook that had suffered water damage at the pump later was apparently already being altered during the crucial time frame. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Croft's arrival, his usually genial demeanor replaced by barely contained frustration. "Dorothy, I need to speak with you about Inspector Craddock's questions regarding the festival accounts," he announced without preamble. "There are some irregularities that require explanation." Miss Marple observed the subtle exchange of glances between the doctor and Mrs. Pemberton, noting how both seemed to stiffen at the mention of financial discrepancies. "Nothing serious, I hope," she remarked gently. Dr. Croft's laugh held little humor. "Ashworth's final act of spite, it seems. He discovered that we'd been redirecting some of his charitable contributions to families he'd specifically excluded from assistance. The Henderson Cottage situation, the Miller Farm loans, we couldn't stand by and watch people suffer while he played philanthropist with conditions. Reginald was furious when he found out yesterday afternoon," Mrs. Pemberton added quietly. "He threatened to expose what he called our unauthorized redistribution and have us prosecuted for fraud. Said he'd make a public announcement during his speech, destroy our reputations completely." Miss Marple absorbed this revelation with growing understanding. The web of motives was expanding far beyond Timothy Fletcher's financial desperation to include moral indignation and community protection. Both Dr. Croft and Mrs. Pemberton had compelling reasons to silence Ashworth before he could destroy their charitable work and reputations. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple reflected on how the afternoon had transformed her understanding of the case. The murder was revealing itself as something far more complex than simple financial desperation. involving multiple people with equally compelling motives and a carefully orchestrated deception that extended well beyond the obvious suspect. The complexity revealed at the vicarage had transformed Miss Marple's understanding of the case entirely, and she found herself drawn toward Eleanor Ashworth's imposing residence on the hill. The widow's conspicuous absence from the village's gossip networks and her careful distance from her husband at the festival suggested layers of domestic discord that required delicate exploration. Miss Marple had learned that grief and relief often wore remarkably similar expressions, particularly when observed through the lens of village scrutiny. Eleanor Ashworth received her unexpected visitor with the strained courtesy of someone struggling to maintain social proprieties while wrestling with overwhelming circumstances. Her drawing room, elegantly appointed yet somehow hollow, reflected a woman accustomed to controlling appearances even when her private world had crumbled. "How thoughtful of you to call," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the rehearsed quality of someone who had been practicing normal conversation. "These past hours have been quite devastating, as you might imagine." Miss Marple settled into the offered chair, noting the fresh tear stains on Eleanor's lace handkerchief and the way her hands trembled when she thought herself unobserved. "Such a terrible shock for the entire community," she agreed gently, "though I suspect the burden falls heaviest on those who knew him best." Eleanor's composure wavered momentarily. "Reginald could be extraordinarily difficult," she admitted quietly. "His treatment of people, his business methods, I had begun to find them increasingly troubling." The carefully chosen words suggested volumes about the Ashworth marriage, and Miss Marple studied Eleanor's face with renewed interest. "Miss Thornley mentioned that you had been experiencing some difficulties," she observed with gentle directness. Eleanor's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face flushed with anger before she could control the response. "Vivian had absolutely no right to discuss our private affairs," she said sharply. "That girl has been far too presumptuous lately, inserting herself into matters beyond her position. Young people sometimes mistake proximity for privilege." Miss Marple agreed mildly, though privately she noted the vehemence of Eleanor's response. "I imagine she was attempting to be supportive during difficult times." "Supportive," Eleanor repeated with bitter emphasis. "Yesterday afternoon, she actually suggested I should leave Reginald, claiming his business practices were morally indefensible. Said she had been documenting everything and could provide evidence for legal proceedings." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as this revelation settled into place. Miss Thornley's role extended far beyond secretarial duties. She had been actively working against her employer's interests, gathering evidence and encouraging his wife's rebellion. As Miss Marple prepared to leave, she noticed Miss Vivian Thornley approaching through the garden, her usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled and a small bag clutched tightly in her hands. The secretary's eyes darted nervously when she spotted Miss Marple, and there was something furtive about her movements that struck the elderly detective as significant. Taking her leave, Miss Marple made her way back toward the village green, where the remnants of the festival still awaited clearing. Near the ceremonial beacon, she encountered Mr. Willis, the band conductor, rolling up his music stands with obvious frustration. "Never known such confusion," he complained. "We were prepared for the beacon lighting at 8:15 precisely, but the mechanism wouldn't function. Someone had tampered with the wind guard rope, broken it and retied it with the most appalling knotwork. Cost us nearly 20 minutes of delays." Miss Marple examined the beacon once Mr. Willis departed, her observant eyes taking in every detail. The retied rope displayed the same clumsy granny knot she had noticed on the cord bundles, an untidy crossing where a competent hand would have secured it properly. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the beacon to delay the ceremony and create a pocket of privacy around the storage area. The implications crystallized in her mind with startling clarity. The same person who had murdered Reginald Ashworth had also ensured the ceremony's delay, providing themselves with the necessary time and isolation to approach their victim without witnesses. It was methodical planning disguised as coincidental mechanical failure. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on how the day's discoveries had revealed a carefully orchestrated deception. The murder wasn't a crime of sudden passion or desperate opportunity, but rather the culmination of meticulous planning by someone with intimate knowledge of both the festival arrangements and Ashworth's habits. The question now was identifying which of the several people with compelling motives had possessed both the access and the calculating determination to execute such a scheme. The evening's discoveries had crystallized Miss Marple's understanding of the methodical planning behind Ashworth's murder, but as she settled into her cottage with a cup of tea, she found herself pondering the psychological profile of someone capable of such calculated deception. The sabotaged beacon revealed a mind that thought several steps ahead, yet the clumsy knotwork suggested either deliberate misdirection or a moment of uncharacteristic panic. Her contemplation was interrupted by a hesitant knock at her door. Miss Vivian Thornley stood on the threshold, her usually impeccable appearance thoroughly disheveled. Rain had darkened her hair, and the small bag she clutched seemed to contain the weight of terrible secrets. Her eyes darted nervously toward the street, as if she feared being observed. "Miss Marple," she began, her voice barely steadier than her trembling hands. "I must speak with someone who might understand. I've heard you have experience with these dreadful matters, and I simply don't know where else to turn." Miss Marple welcomed the distressed young woman inside, noting how Vivian's composure had completely crumbled since their brief encounter at Eleanor Ashworth's house. "My dear child, you appear quite overwrought. Please, sit by the fire and let me prepare some tea." As the kettle heated, Vivian paced restlessly around the small sitting room, her agitation growing more pronounced with each passing moment. "I must confess something terrible," she finally burst out, her words tumbling together in desperate haste. "I sabotaged the beacon yesterday evening. I broke the wind guard rope deliberately and retied it badly to delay the ceremony." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision, her expression remaining perfectly neutral despite the significance of this admission. "That explains the poor knotwork Mr. Willis mentioned. What prompted such drastic action?" "Mr. Ashworth intended to use his festival speech as a platform for revenge," Vivian explained, her voice cracking with shame and fear. "He had discovered Dr. Croft and Mrs. Pemberton's charitable redirections, and he planned to expose them publicly. But worse than that, he intended to humiliate Mrs. Ashworth by revealing certain personal matters that would have destroyed her reputation entirely." The confession painted Ashworth as even more vindictive than Miss Marple had initially suspected, a man who took genuine pleasure in wielding his social position as a weapon against those who crossed him. "You were attempting to prevent this public humiliation?" "I thought if the ceremony were delayed or disrupted, he might postpone his speech, perhaps reconsider his vindictive plans," Vivian said miserably. "I'm no good with ropes or knots, that's how I cut my finger. The whole thing was clumsy and desperate." Miss Marple studied the young woman's anguished face, noting the genuine distress that accompanied her confession. Yet something in Vivian's manner suggested she was withholding additional crucial information. "There's something else troubling you, isn't there, my dear?" Vivian's composure cracked entirely. She reached into her bag and withdrew a crumpled piece of paper, her hands shaking as she smoothed it out. "Someone used my notebook paper to forge a message summoning Mr. Ashworth to the storage tent. A page was torn out while I was fetching supplies, and later I learned he had received a note signed with Vive that he believed came from me." Miss Marple examined the paper fragment with intense interest, noting the distinctive serrated edge and the angular handwriting that attempted to mimic Vivian's natural script. "You didn't write this message?" "Absolutely not," Vivian insisted. "I had planned to request a private meeting after the ceremony, but I never sent anything that evening. Someone deliberately used my paper and forged my initial to lure him to his death." The implications were staggering. The murderer had not only planned the beacon sabotage and the killing itself, but had also orchestrated a sophisticated deception to implicate Vivian while providing themselves with the perfect opportunity to approach Ashworth without suspicion. It suggested someone with intimate knowledge of both the festival preparations and Vivian's relationship with her employer. "There's one more detail," Vivian whispered, her voice dropping to barely audible levels. "When I went to wash my notebook at the pump, I noticed a distinct smell on my hands, carbolic soap. It was lingering in the air near the storage tent, much stronger than you'd expect from normal cleaning." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as this final piece of evidence settled into place. Carbolic soap was favored by medical professionals and those who prized cleanliness above comfort. Combined with the methodical planning and the forged note, it painted a picture of someone who approached murder with the same meticulous attention to hygiene and detail they brought to their professional responsibilities. As Vivian prepared to leave, clutching her evidence with renewed determination to present everything to Inspector Craddock, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the chilling efficiency of the crime. The killer had not only eliminated Ashworth but had systematically attempted to frame an innocent young woman while covering their own tracks with professional thoroughness. The morning brought a grey persistence of rain that seemed to wash the last vestiges of festival cheer from Lantern Hill's streets. Miss Marple accompanied Miss Vivian Thornley to the police station, noting how the young woman clutched her evidence with the desperate intensity of someone whose reputation depended entirely on the truth emerging from carefully preserved fragments. Inspector Craddock received them with professional courtesy, though his expression sharpened considerably as Vivian laid the forged note on his desk and confessed to sabotaging the beacon. "You understand this places you at the center of events, Miss Thornley," he observed, examining the paper's serrated edge with methodical precision. "Your initial appears on the message that summoned Ashworth to his death." "I understand completely," Vivian replied with trembling composure. "But I did not write that note. Someone deliberately used my paper to implicate me while providing themselves with the perfect opportunity to approach Mr. Ashworth without suspicion." Miss Marple watched Craddock compare the torn edge with Vivian's notebook, noting how the match was convincing yet somehow too perfect. "Inspector," she interjected gently, "Miss Thornley's confession about the beacon demonstrates foolishness born of desperation, not murderous calculation. One expects untidy knots from frightened hands working in darkness, but the same clumsy technique appeared on both the beacon rope and the murder weapon." Craddock's eyebrows lifted with interest. "You believe the same person was responsible for both?" "I believe the same inexperience was responsible," Miss Marple corrected. "Someone unfamiliar with proper knot work, yet attempting to appear competent. Combined with Miss Thornley's observation about the carbolic soap, it suggests someone with medical training who approaches even murder with professional habits." Their conversation was interrupted by Constable Bell's hurried arrival. "Inspector, we've had a break-in at Miss Thornley's lodgings. Mrs. Cripps found the room ransacked this morning, papers burned in the grate. Someone was looking for evidence." The implications struck Miss Marple immediately. The murderer had learned of Vivian's intention to confess and had attempted to destroy any remaining evidence that might contradict their carefully constructed deception. It suggested someone with access to information about the investigation's progress. As they made their way to examine the scene, Miss Marple found herself studying the faces of early morning villagers with renewed interest. Dr. Alistair Croft emerged from his surgery, ostensibly checking his morning post, but his movements seemed unusually agitated for such a mundane task. When he spotted their small procession, his reaction was immediate, and telling a momentary freezing of posture before he forced a smile of professional concern. "Terrible business about young Fletcher," he called out, approaching with what appeared to be casual interest. "I understand the inspector has been questioning him again. The poor boy seems quite beside himself." Miss Marple noted how Dr. Croft's eyes lingered on the evidence bag Vivian carried, and how his hands showed the distinctive redness that came from repeated washing with strong soap. Indeed, though I suspect the truth may prove more complex than initial appearances suggest," she replied mildly. Dr. Croft's laugh held a forced quality. "Truth has a way of emerging eventually, doesn't it? Though sometimes the obvious explanation proves correct after all." "Sometimes," Miss Marple agreed, studying his face with gentle persistence. "Though I've found that when someone takes great care to appear obvious, they're often concealing something quite different beneath the surface." The doctor's composure wavered almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around his eyes that confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions. His medical training, his access to festival preparations, his knowledge of village relationships, and his obvious resentment toward Ashworth's vindictive nature all aligned with the methodical planning evident in the murder. Most tellingly, his attempt to direct attention toward Fletcher's guilt suggested someone desperately hoping the investigation would conclude before deeper examination revealed the truth. As Dr. Croft excused himself with obvious haste, Miss Marple reflected on how the morning's developments had crystallized her understanding of the case. The murderer possessed both the medical knowledge to kill efficiently and the psychological sophistication to orchestrate an elaborate deception. Yet their very attempts to appear innocent were revealing the calculated mind behind Reginald Ashworth's death. Dr. Croft's hasty departure left Miss Marple contemplating the delicate art of psychological revelation. The morning's encounter had confirmed her suspicions, but proving guilt required more than observing nervous behavior and noting carbolic soap residue. She needed to create circumstances that would compel the truth to emerge naturally, allowing the murderer to betray themselves through their own defensive reactions. The examination of Vivian's ransacked lodgings provided the opportunity she sought. Mrs. Cripps wrung her hands at the doorway as Inspector Craddock sifted through the charred remains in the grate, discovering partially burned fragments that revealed the intruder's desperate purpose. Among the ashes lay the remnants of what appeared to be medical correspondence, along with a distinctive paperclip of the type used by professional offices. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for, Craddock observed, examining the systematic nature of the search. They weren't interested in valuables, just documents and papers. Mrs. Cripps approached with obvious reluctance. "I hate to mention this, but I did see someone in the garden around 9 last evening, moving about with a torch near Miss Thornley's window. Walking careful-like, the way doctors do around sleeping patients. Had a motor car waiting at the lane's end with no lamps showing." Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing certainty. The midnight visitor, the burned evidence, the professional thoroughness of the search all pointed to someone accustomed to working under pressure while maintaining meticulous attention to detail. Someone whose medical training emphasized both efficiency and cleanliness. "Inspector," she said thoughtfully, "I believe a direct approach might prove most illuminating. Sometimes the gentlest pressure applied at precisely the right moment can accomplish what forceful interrogation cannot." An hour later, Miss Marple found herself seated in Dr. Croft's surgery, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed his barely controlled tension. He sat behind his desk, ostensibly reading a medical journal, though she noted how his hands trembled slightly when turning pages. "Good morning, Doctor," she began with characteristic gentleness. "I was passing and thought I might inquire after poor Mr. Fletcher. Such a trying time for him, being suspected of murder." Dr. Croft offered her tea with practiced courtesy, though his smile failed to reach his eyes. "Indeed, Miss Marple, the evidence against him does seem rather compelling." "So it appears on the surface," she agreed, her needles never pausing. "But surfaces can be deceiving. Take the matter of knots, for instance. Mr. Ashworth, being a naval man, was reportedly quite skilled with rope work. Yet both the murder weapon and the beacon showed the same clumsy granny knots, so untidy, as if someone entirely unaccustomed to such work had tied them in great haste. Dr. Croft's hand clenched almost imperceptibly on his desk. Perhaps panic affected even experienced hands, he suggested, his voice carefully controlled. Perhaps, Miss Marple mused, studying his face, though it seems curious that one person, unfamiliar with proper technique, was responsible for both. And speaking of curious things, what a clever deception to use someone else's notebook paper and forge their initial to lure a victim, especially when that someone had already provided the perfect distraction by sabotaging the beacon. She watched his composure begin to crack. Miss Thornley mentioned detecting carbolic soap near the storage tent, such a distinctive clinical smell. One associates it with medical establishments, or perhaps someone particularly meticulous about hygiene. Dr. Croft stood abruptly, moving to the window with his back to her. "Such details are hardly conclusive," he said, his voice strained. "Of course not individually," Miss Marple continued conversationally, "but combined with the midnight visit to Miss Thornley's lodgings, the systematic destruction of evidence, and the professional efficiency of the entire scheme, well, it paints quite a complete picture, doesn't it?" The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken accusation. When Dr. Croft finally turned from the window, his face was pale, his carefully maintained facade crumbling. His eyes darted around the room as if seeking escape, and Miss Marple recognized the profound, chilling silence of a man whose guilt had finally been exposed through gentle, relentless logic. He knew that she knew, and in that moment of recognition, the truth stood revealed between them. The silence, in Dr. Croft's surgery, stretched like a delicate thread, vibrating with the weight of unspoken truths and inevitable revelation. Miss Marple continued her gentle knitting, allowing the quiet to work its psychological pressure while she observed the complete transformation of his carefully maintained professional composure. His hands, which had performed countless medical procedures with steady precision, now gripped the window frame with white-knuckled desperation. "You know," Miss Marple said conversationally, her needles clicking with soothing regularity, "I've always found it fascinating how people reveal themselves through the smallest actions. Take knot tying, for instance. A sailor learns proper technique so thoroughly that even under extreme stress, his hands remember the correct motions. Yet someone unfamiliar with rope work will always revert to the same clumsy crossing, no matter how many times they attempt it." Dr. Croft's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent, staring out at the grey morning with the intensity of a man seeking escape that didn't exist. The beacon rope, the murder weapon, even the hastily retied cord bundles all showed the same inexpert technique. Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence. "Someone with medical training might approach such tasks with surgical precision in planning, yet lack the practical experience to execute them properly. Rather like performing an operation with the wrong instruments, I imagine." When he finally turned from the window, his face had aged years in the space of minutes. The professional mask had cracked completely, revealing a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. "You cannot possibly understand the situation," he said, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone whose secret burden had become unbearable. "Perhaps not entirely," Miss Marple agreed with characteristic gentleness, "though I suspect it involved more than simple moral indignation about Mr. Ashworth's business practices. Men don't typically resort to murder over charitable fund diversions, however passionate their feelings about social justice." Dr. Croft moved away from the window with the careful steps of someone navigating treacherous ground. "Decent in this village. One vindictive act at a time. But you're quite right, it was more personal than charitable concerns." "The festival speech," Miss Marple observed, watching his face carefully. "Mrs. Ashworth mentioned that her husband intended to name names and reveal certain personal matters. That suggests he had discovered compromising information about multiple villagers. He had been collecting secrets for months," Dr. Croft admitted, his professional composure finally abandoning him entirely. old gambling debts, financial irregularities, personal correspondence, anything that could be used as leverage or ammunition for public humiliation. The festival was to be his grand performance, his moment of complete dominance over everyone who had ever crossed him. Miss Marple absorbed this revelation with growing understanding, though she noted how Dr. Croft's confession remained carefully incomplete, focusing on Ashworth's general vindictiveness rather than his own specific vulnerabilities. And you felt that drastic action was necessary to prevent this public destruction. Someone had to stop him, he said quietly, then caught himself, as if realizing how much he had already revealed. That is to say, one could understand how someone might feel driven to desperate measures. The careful shift from personal admission back to hypothetical speculation didn't escape Miss Marple's notice. She continued knitting, allowing the silence to encourage further revelation while observing how his hands trembled slightly whenever they moved near his medical case. The timing was quite remarkable, she mused aloud. Miss Thornley's sabotage of the beacon provided the perfect opportunity for someone to approach Mr. Ashworth privately, and using her notebook paper to forge the summoning note was particularly clever. It ensured he would respond without suspicion while potentially implicating an innocent young woman. Dr. Croft's reaction was immediate and telling. His face flushed, then drained of color as he realized how completely his methodical planning had been unraveled by gentle, persistent observation. "I never intended for Miss Thornley to be seriously suspected," he said desperately. She was simply convenient. The admission hung in the air between them, confirming Miss Marple's deductions while revealing the calculating mind behind what had initially appeared to be a crime of passion. Before either could speak further, footsteps approached the surgery door, and Inspector Craddock entered with the measured authority of someone who had been waiting for precisely this moment. "Dr. Croft," Craddock said quietly, his eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment, "I believe we need to continue this conversation at the station. There are several matters requiring clarification regarding the events of the festival evening." Dr. Croft looked from Miss Marple to the inspector, understanding that his carefully constructed deception had finally collapsed under the weight of accumulated evidence and gentle psychological pressure. The game was over, though the final moves remained to be played out with proper legal formality. As he gathered his coat with the resigned movements of a man accepting inevitable consequences, Miss Marple reflected on how the morning's revelation had confirmed her understanding of both the crime's methodical planning and the complex web of motivations that had driven a respected physician to murder. The complete truth, she knew, would emerge in the final reckoning that lay ahead. The formal confrontation unfolded in the vicarage reading room, where Inspector Craddock had quietly assembled the key figures from the festival evening. Eleanor Ashworth sat rigidly composed, while Mrs. Pemberton twisted her handkerchief with nervous energy. Timothy Fletcher appeared wan with residual worry, and Miss Vivian Thornley clutched her torn notebook like a lifeline. Dr. Croft occupied a chair near the window, his professional composure intact, but his hands betraying subtle tremors. Miss Marple settled modestly by the hearth, her knitting needles providing a gentle counterpoint to the mounting tension. Inspector Craddock began with methodical precision. "We're here to resolve the discrepancies that have emerged during our investigation. Mr. Fletcher, your alibi regarding the beacon lighting cannot stand, as the beacon never functioned that evening." Timothy swallowed hard. "I panicked, Inspector. I thought if I sounded helpful, you might believe I wasn't skulking about. I left Mr. Ashworth at 8:20 and wandered the green in distress. His threats about the unauthorized loans had terrified me." "Miss Thornley," Craddock continued, "your confession about sabotaging the beacon is noted, along with the forged note bearing your initial." Vivian placed the crumpled paper on the table. "Someone used my notebook paper to lure Mr. Ashworth to the storage tent. I never wrote this message." Miss Marple's observant eyes moved between the assembled faces. "The murderer required two essential elements: privacy and compliance. The sabotaged beacon provided the former, while the forged note ensured the latter. Mr. Ashworth responded without suspicion because he expected someone he believed he could dominate. She paused, allowing the implications to settle. Consider the evidence pattern. The same clumsy knotwork appeared on both the beacon rope and the murder weapon, someone entirely inexperienced with proper technique, yet attempting to appear competent. Mr. Ashworth, with his naval background, would never have produced such untidy work. Croft's hands clenched almost imperceptibly, but he remained silent. Then there's the carbolic soap detected near the storage tent, Miss Marple continued conversationally. Such a distinctive, clinical scent suggests someone with medical training who maintains professional hygiene habits even under extreme stress. The midnight visit to Miss Thornley's lodgings was equally revealing, Inspector Craddock added. Someone searched systematically for documents, burning correspondence that included a distinctive medical office paperclip. Miss Marple's needles never paused. Dr. Croft, you discovered that Mr. Ashworth intended his festival speech to be more than mere vindictiveness about charitable fund redirections. He had been collecting compromising information about various villages, preparing for a grand performance of public humiliation. Dr. Croft's carefully maintained facade began to crack. Reginald had become obsessed with power over people's reputations, he said quietly. The charitable funds were merely the beginning. He threatened to expose your role in the unauthorized redistributions, Miss Marple observed gently. But more personally devastating, he had discovered certain professional decisions from your past, difficult cases, where compassionate treatment conflicted with strict medical protocols. He intended to present these as evidence of professional incompetence, destroying both your practice and your reputation for mercy. Eleanor Ashworth looked down at her clasped hands, while Mrs. Pemberton gasped softly at this revelation. You realized that Miss Thornley's beacon sabotage provided the perfect opportunity, Miss Marple continued. You forged the summoning note using her paper, ensuring Mr. Ashworth would respond without suspicion, while potentially implicating an innocent young woman. The murder itself was swift. He turned his back, expecting a private conversation with his secretary, never suspecting the danger. Dr. Croft's shoulders sagged as his composure finally collapsed entirely. I thought I was protecting the village from his vindictive cruelty, he whispered. Instead, I've brought far worse upon everyone. Inspector Craddock rose with quiet authority. Dr. Alistair Croft, you are under arrest for the murder of Reginald Ashworth. As the formal arrest proceeded, Miss Marple reflected on how desperate circumstances had transformed a healer into a killer, his medical training providing both the methodical approach and the fatal efficiency that had nearly created the perfect crime. The formal arrest of Dr. Alistair Croft left the vicarage reading room wrapped in profound silence, the kind that settles over a community when comfortable certainties have been shattered beyond repair. Miss Marple continued her gentle knitting as Inspector Craddock completed the necessary procedures, observing how each person processed the revelation according to their own relationship with both victim and murderer. Eleanor Ashworth sat with rigid composure, her face revealing the complex mixture of grief, relief, and something approaching vindication that comes to those who discover their private suffering had deeper roots than they understood. I had suspected Reginald was gathering information about people, she said quietly, her voice carrying the hollow quality of someone whose entire understanding of her marriage had been fundamentally altered. But I never imagined the systematic nature of his campaign to dominate through fear. Timothy Fletcher slumped in his chair like a man reprieved from execution, his earlier panic replaced by exhausted relief. The bank has agreed to review my case, he announced with tentative hope. Mrs. Pemberton and several others have written letters supporting the compassionate nature of those unauthorized loans. Perhaps some good can come from this terrible business. Mrs. Pemberton dabbed at her eyes with a thoroughly wrinkled handkerchief. Poor Dr. Croft, she murmured. To think that his merciful medical decisions were being twisted into weapons against him. Reginald was preparing to destroy a man whose only crime was showing compassion to suffering patients. Miss Vivian Thornley, her earlier terror replaced by quiet vindication, clutched her torn notebook with renewed determination. "I shall leave Lantern Hill," she announced with surprising steadiness. "Mrs. Ashworth has kindly offered to provide references, and I believe a fresh start would benefit everyone. This experience has taught me how easily sincerity can be misinterpreted." As the formal proceedings concluded and the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple made her way through the village, noting how news of Dr. Croft's confession spread with the peculiar mixture of shock and relief that accompanies the resolution of terrible uncertainty. Mrs. Gladys Hartwell, for once, found herself with little to add to the facts, while other villagers struggled to reconcile their trusted physician with the calculating murderer he had become. The festival debris was finally cleared from the village green, though the cheerful decorations seemed to carry new, sobering meaning. The beacon stood properly repaired, its rope now tied with competent knots by Mr. Willis, serving as a quiet reminder of how small deceptions could escalate into tragedy. Dr. Croft's surgery remained closed, a stark symbol of fractured trust that would take considerable time to heal. In the days that followed, Lantern Hill slowly resumed its gentle rhythms, though with an undeniable undercurrent of unease. The illusion of perfect tranquility had been irrevocably shattered, revealing the hidden currents of resentment and desperation that could flow beneath even the most placid surfaces. Eleanor Ashworth announced her intention to sell the imposing house on the hill and establish a quiet trust for those her husband had threatened to destroy, transforming vindictive legacy into charitable purpose. Miss Marple reflected on the case as she completed her pale blue cardigan in the peaceful solitude of her cottage. The murder had revealed how easily respected members of society could be driven to desperate measures when their carefully constructed lives faced complete destruction. Dr. Croft's medical training had provided both the methodical planning and fatal efficiency, yet his very attempts to appear innocent had revealed the calculating mind behind what initially seemed like passionate impulse. The tragedy lay not merely in Ashworth's death, but in how unchecked malice had corrupted a healer into becoming a killer, transforming both victim and murderer into casualties of human nature's darker impulses. The village would heal, as villages always did, but it would carry forever the quiet knowledge that beneath ordinary facades, extraordinary secrets often lurked, waiting for the right pressure to reveal themselves in ways both terrible and illuminating. Outside her window, an owl called once through the gathering dusk, and Lantern Hill exhaled softly into the peaceful night. 3 weeks had passed since that grey morning when Dr. Alistair Croft's carefully constructed facade had finally crumbled under the weight of gentle, persistent truth. Miss Marple found herself once again on her familiar bench by the village green, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a new project. A cheerful yellow cardigan that seemed to capture the tentative optimism beginning to return to Lantern Hill. The paper lanterns had been carefully stored away until the following year's festival, though Miss Marple wondered privately whether the community would ever again approach such celebrations with quite the same innocent enthusiasm. Murder, she reflected, had a peculiar way of casting permanent shadows over even the most cheerful traditions, yet life possessed an equally remarkable capacity for healing and renewal. Timothy Fletcher walked past with renewed confidence, his earlier panic replaced by the quiet dignity of someone whose integrity had been thoroughly vindicated. The bank's review board had not only exonerated him but officially commended his compassionate lending practices as sound judgment rather than financial irregularities. He paused to tip his hat, respectfully to Miss Marple, his smile carrying genuine warmth rather than the desperate anxiety that had marked their earlier encounters. Eleanor Ashworth had completed the sale of her imposing house on the hill, using the substantial proceeds to establish the Lantern Hill Community Trust. The irony wasn't lost on Miss Marple that Reginald Ashworth's estate would now fund the very charitable work he had attempted to destroy through vindictive exposure. Eleanor herself had taken modest lodgings in the neighboring village of Little Wickham, seeking the blessed anonymity that would allow her to rebuild her life away from the suffocating weight of her husband's reputation. Miss Vivian Thornley had departed for London with excellent references and what appeared to be genuine relief at escaping the scene of so much deception. Her final conversation with Miss Marple had revealed a young woman whose faith in human nature had been severely tested, but not entirely destroyed. The experience had taught her, she said, that sincerity must be tempered with wisdom, and that good intentions without proper judgment could lead to consequences far more terrible than anticipated. Dr. Margaret Henley, Croft's replacement, had arrived the previous week and was already winning the community's cautious approval. The surgery had been thoroughly cleaned and reorganized, though Miss Marple suspected it would take considerable time before villagers could entirely separate the healing space from memories of its former occupants' dark transformation. Trust, once broken by such fundamental betrayal, required patient cultivation to restore. Dorothy Pemberton approached with her usual tea tray, her earlier agitation replaced by something approaching peace. "I find myself wondering," she confided as she settled beside Miss Marple, "whether we failed to notice Dr. Croft's growing desperation. Were there signs we simply chose to ignore?" Miss Marple considered the question while accepting her cup with gentle thanks. Human nature possesses a remarkable capacity for concealment, particularly when desperation drives otherwise decent people to extraordinary measures. Dr. Croft's medical training taught him to maintain composure under pressure, but it also provided him with the methodical approach that made his deception so nearly perfect. "The knots revealed the truth," she continued thoughtfully. "Mr. Ashworth's naval background meant he would never have left such clumsy work. Someone else had tied those ropes, someone with medical precision in planning but no practical experience with seamanship. Combined with the carbolic soap, the systematic evidence destruction, and the calculated use of Miss Thornley's materials, it painted a picture of desperate intelligence corrupted by fear." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Marple reflected on the deeper lessons embedded in the tragedy. The murder had demonstrated how easily respected pillars of society could be driven to desperate measures when their carefully constructed lives faced complete destruction. More troubling still, it had revealed how the very qualities that made someone an excellent physician, methodical thinking, attention to detail, and the ability to make crucial decisions under pressure could be perverted into the tools of murder when moral boundaries collapsed under sufficient stress. The true tragedy lay not merely in Reginald Ashworth's death, but in the systematic corruption of a healer's oath. Croft had genuinely believed he was protecting his community from vindictive cruelty, yet his solution had brought far greater suffering than Ashworth's threats ever could have achieved. As evening approached and the village settled into its gentle rhythms, Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return home. Lantern Hill would heal completely, as communities always did, though it would carry forever the quiet knowledge that beneath the most ordinary facades, extraordinary secrets often lurked. The next summer's festival would undoubtedly proceed, shadowed by memory yet enriched by a deeper understanding of human complexity. The familiar owl called once through the gathering dusk, and Miss Marple smiled softly, understanding that in solving this particular mystery, she had once again witnessed both the worst and best of human nature intertwined in ways that defied simple explanation.